Hello again, everyone. So really keen to start off the next session for another panel for NADA's International Women's Day talk. So this part of the International Women's Day Forum, we're going to be talking about promoting inclusivity for women and girls who have trans experiences in the healthcare setting. So before Starlady from Zoe-Belle Gender Collective starts her talk, I'm just going to speak a little bit about some resources that NADA's produced in order to assist services with promoting trans inclusivity in healthcare and in the AOD space. So the first resource is that NADA has a gender and sexuality diverse worker network for AOD workers. And so that's essentially open to people who are gender and or sexuality diverse who work in the AOD space. We aren't just open to people from New South Wales, but across the continent, although we do have a New South Wales focus. So some of the things the network does is basically providing support to other AOD workers. We're performing some advocacy work. We organise events, share resources. So what I'll do is after I finish talking and before Starlady starts, I'll just share a link to that network in the chat in case you want to join up. A second form of support we have for promoting trans inclusivity in the AOD space is NADA's Access and Equity Guide. So that was updated last year, and that has a section in it on how to best support people who are trans or sexuality diverse in the AOD space. And I'll share a link to the chat after I finish speaking to that guide as well for you to check out. And so finally, NADA's Gender and Sexuality Diverse Workers Network is going to be holding a forum in May, which we'd love everybody to come to. And as I said, it's open to people irrespective of whether they're gender and sexuality diverse or not. And so there's going to be some talks in there, including a panel on promoting inclusivity in AOD spaces for women with trans experiences, just to provide support around that topic. So the day hasn't been confirmed yet, but when it is, it will go up on the events section of the NADA website, and we'd love you all to come. And there's also, just going to be hopefully a section in there about, talking about how you can actually implement that advice within your service. So I'm really excited that the next part, I'm going to hand it over to Starlady right now. Starlady's pronouns are, as I mentioned, she, her. She's from the Zoe-Belle Gender Collective in Victoria. And she'll be talking about how transmisogyny can be a barrier to accessing healthcare services for girls and women. So that session will be followed by 5 to 10 minutes of Q&A. And so please just enter your questions in the Q&A function. That would be fantastic. So I'm just going to hand it over to Starlady. Thanks. Sorry, I also meant to mention the slides. I'm going to be emailing them through as well to people who have attended today. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to share them in the chat, some tech issues, but we will be providing them to everybody who's come so that you can look at them. And Starlady, I think you're on mute, but hopefully we can hear you.
You've got to love that. It's like one of the simple tech issues. Welcome everybody. It's really exciting to be talking to you today about identifying and challenging transmisogyny, in particular within sort of like health and human service provision. So my name's Starlady. I identify as a queer, trans woman or trans feminine person, and I come from a white settler background. And I'm the program manager at the Zoe-Belle Gender Collective, and my pronouns are she, her, and hers. I'd just like to start off by acknowledging the traditional owners of the country for wherever you are from today. Today, I'm coming from Dja Dja Wurrung and Tangerang country. I would like to acknowledge elders past, present and emerging, and extend that out to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people who might be in this presentation today or watching it. In particular, because this presentation has a trans focus, I like to acknowledge sister girls and brother boys. And so in a resource called Trans 101, a young brother boy called Zach says, sister girls and brother boys have existed within Indigenous culture for thousands of years before Western cultures invaded Australia. The variation of terms brother boy and sister girl change from tribe to tribe, group to group, but essentially most Indigenous tribes and groups have a term for trans people. I recommend you check out more of from Zach in Trans 101. I'd like to start off by, acknowledging the impact that transmisogyny has on trans women and trans feminine people. And to broadly, when I'm talking about trans women today, I'm talking about a really sort of broad group of people. And so I'm going to be talking about people who identify as a trans woman, women who may have a trans and gender diverse history or experience, but don't necessarily identify as a trans woman. We'll also be talking about trans feminine people and some non-binary people. So transmisogyny is a form of discrimination that combines transphobia with misogyny that affects many trans women, trans feminine, and some non-binary people. Here we have like a quote. This quote is from Trans Pathways, and it's of a young trans woman who identifies as female, says, friends I previously used to game with online to sort of decided to call me a whore, weirdo, and pervert, etc. when I came out. Some family members regularly say I'm only ever going to be a man in a dress. And I think that really sort of like highlights many of the sort of transmisogyny experiences that many trans women will sort of like experience. And so in talking about transmisogyny and its impact on trans women and their access to services, I think we've just got to create some frameworks in and around discrimination. And so much of transmisogyny is I guess, comes from cis-normativity and cis-sexism. So that's the belief or assumption that all people are or should be cisgender, which is cis-normativity, and taking that further into sexism, and that all other forms of gender diversity are unhealthy, unnatural, and a threat to society. Transmisogyny also comes out of transphobia, so the fear, hatred, and intolerance of trans and gender diverse people that can manifest in lots of different attitudes and behaviors, some which are really obvious in terms of their overt forms of violence, but which we're more, people are more skilled in being able to identify that, but we have less skills in being able to pick up the sort of like microaggressions and othering that trans and gender diverse people experience. Transmisogyny also comes from misogyny, and so the hatred and or prejudice towards women. And so often as, I guess, trans women begin to affirm their gender identity, we can often, I guess, in a sense, if we're talking about privilege, we can be losing that sort of like power and sort of privilege that we might have. I also really like to point out that feminism and trans rights are not mutually exclusive. Some people may try to portray that, but I think that's a really significant distraction. And actually, there's this incredible intersection between feminism and trans rights. In particular, both of our sort of communities and movements working together to address the harmful impacts of like rigid gender roles and stereotypes, and which I guess are drivers of violence towards women and trans and gender diverse people broadly. So it's really important that we acknowledge, where does transmisogyny come from? I think transmisogyny, I've traveled across the world, and transmisogyny is definitely occurs, in some cases in a Western cultural context in particular. It doesn't necessarily occur within all sort of cultures or communities. But from a Western cultural perspective, when discussing trans and gender diverse inclusion in our society, it often sort of like centers and focus on myths around trans women, including whether trans women should play sport, our access to bathrooms, change rooms, spas and saunas, and also our access to women's or gendered accommodation. And so trans women broadly bear the brunt of a lot of the sort of discrimination and stigma that's in our, in our society and in our communities. Even sort of, recently some of the debates around trans women's inclusions in sports has really sort of focused on trans women. And despite the sort of lack of any sort of evidence, these sort of harmful myths around trans women are often sexualized and pathologized, portraying trans women as a threat to cis women and to children, that we deceive people, in particular in and around relationships, in particular with cis men. And it always portrays us as perpetrators of sexual-based violence, when in fact, there is no documented evidence or statistics that supports this. But what there is evidence and statistics of is that trans and gender diverse people, in particular trans women, are more likely to be victims of verbal abuse, physical abuse, sexual assault. And if we look at some of the rates, so the actual statistics from the Australian Sexual Health Survey, what we saw is that 36% of trans women had reported ever experiencing sexual violence or coercion, and nearly 45% of non-binary people assigned male at birth had experienced sexual violence or coercion. And so we actually experienced higher rates of sexual assault that compared to other communities. Perpetrators of violence are looking, it's about power and control, and they're looking for people who are vulnerable, and trans women can be very vulnerable in our society on many different levels. We're less likely to be able to access the police and get support. We're less likely to be believed. You can be isolated, from our communities at times. And also many of the sort of gendered-based services that are set up in our society to support or protect victims of violence are often gendered-based, where trans people, in particular trans women, can have challenges in accessing that. Perpetrators of violence know this, and they use this, and they manipulate this. And so it's just really important to be aware. And sometimes, trans people will be, will have some of these things thrown at us or to deny us access to services. And it's just really good to sort of call it out when you see it and challenge it and go, what are you talking about that trans women are a threat to other women? Where is your evidence of that? And if you're talking about an individual client, you'd be going back to safety policies that would exist within any organization and go, actually, there is no evidence that this client is a threat to anyone else. And so we're actually talking about myths here and discrimination here. And so sort of name it and call it out for what it is. It also portrays us as sexual deviants. In sort of discussing some sort of aspects of transmisogyny and some of the evidence that I'm about to show you, we're going to be talking some around language around gender assigned at birth. And so it is important to be aware that due to sort of rigid gender norms and stereotypes within our society, trans and gender diverse people, depending upon their gender assigned at birth, can be impacted differently because of their gender assigned at birth. There are many things that across the spectrum of trans and gender diverse people, regardless of our gender, that we all experience in terms of discrimination and stigma, but there is also some sort of unique issues facing us. And so some of the language that we're using here is assigned male at birth. And so people who are assigned male at birth might identify with terms trans woman, trans feminine, trans femme, non-binary, etc. And assigned female, people who are assigned female at birth might identify with terms trans man, transmasculine, transmasc, non-binary. It is important when we're thinking and talking about these terms, they're not identities, And many of people within the trans and gender diverse community can consider these terms incredibly reductive or feel like they erase or invalidate their trans and gender diverse identity. So please always reflect the language back that people use to self-describe their identities. I'm using this particular language today to talk about this research that we'll be exploring next, and also sort of to differentiate the impacts of rigid gender norms and stereotypes on different people within our community. So if we look here, so ZGBC's position is that transmisogyny impacts all trans women, but in particular, it impacts young trans and gender diverse people and has impacts on trans women and trans feminine people in terms of affirming their gender identity. So this is research from the Australian Trans and Gender Diverse Sexual Health Survey in 2018. And it talks about the average age of a trans person sort of realizing, sharing, and living as their affirmed gender identity. And so this average age that a trans person in this research realized they were trans was about the age of 14. It wasn't until they were 22 years old that they felt comfortable in beginning to tell other people, and the average age that they've started living their lives as their affirmed gender identity was between 24 and 25. And we know that gender affirmation is a protective factor for young people. And so what we're seeing here is the average age is like 14 when they realize, but it's a 10-year gap till they start living their affirmed lives. This is something that we need to break down and we need to shift. We need to be supporting young people in particular to being able to affirm their sort of gender identity. But when we begin to sort of break down the data of when people, I guess, think and start living their lives as trans and gender diverse, it can be different. And so what we see here is that most of the people within this particular research started to begin to think of themselves as trans, under the age of 20. And there were some slight differences, in particular for non-binary people assigned male at birth, but across the board, there was a similar sort of percentage of people, I guess, thinking of themselves as trans, whether trans men, trans women, non-binary people assigned male at birth or female at birth. But when we get to where they're living as part-time or as full-time, what we see here is that trans men and non-binary people assigned female at birth were much more likely to start that process at a younger age than trans women or non-binary people assigned male at birth. And we see this, the ZGBC, which delivers youth workshops across Victoria and is connected with many sort of LGBTIQ youth services. We see this reflected within those youth services as well, where there's much more trans masculine people than there is compared to trans feminine people. But when we sort of look at data in and amongst older trans and gender diverse people, we often see the populations of trans feminine people or trans masculine people is really sort of quite similar. And so what we're seeing here is, I guess, data and the beginning of evidence to say that young trans women and trans feminine people may be significantly delaying their gender affirmation to a later age. Not that there's a different amounts of people within the populations of trans and gender diverse people. And ZGBC does really clearly believe that some of this is the impacts of transmisogyny. And so what are some of the things that are sort of contributing to transmisogyny? And some of those will be standards of beauty and sort of like rigid gender roles and stereotypes within our society. And so all trans and gender diverse people, I guess, experience high amounts of pressure to meet cisgender beauty standards and gender stereotypes, but in particular, this impacts trans women and trans feminine people. And in particular, the pressure to pass. So passing refers to when trans and gender diverse are read or perceived as cisgender. So for a trans woman, it'll be when people might meet a trans woman down the street and you won't be able to tell she has a transgender history or experience just by looking at her. You may assume that she's a cisgender woman, and passing most definitely has an impact in and around people's experiences of discrimination and stigma in our society. And so there should never be any pressure placed on any trans and gender diverse person to pass or to meet any sort of like gender stereotypes. But what we saw in some of the data, I guess, within writing themselves in for was that trans women or trans and gender diverse people did experience an incredible amount of pressure. So 90% of the young people, it was a study of young LGBTIQ people, over like, I think 6,000 young people were involved in this survey. And 90% of the trans and gender diverse respondents felt pressure to pass as cisgender. And 87% of them respondents felt pressure, trans and gender diverse people, to meet typical gender stereotypes. And this has a significant impact on the lives and well-being of trans people, in particular trans feminine people. And it may impact, our community's, I guess, feeling sense of safety and well-being, including, I guess, our ability to express our gender identity in authentic and empowering ways. Rigid gender norms and cisnormativity can also impact our fear or the realities of experiencing transphobic violence and discrimination. It can cause incredible distress in terms of our bodies and in and around gendered spaces. Like trans people can have a real fear and worry about accessing gendered services, accommodation, and amenities. It can create a real hypervigilance around how you express your gender identity and how you are perceived by other people. For some people, it might impact, I guess, in terms of like how people might internalize those feelings and those experiences, where people might feel inadequate or in terms of not feeling like they're trans enough is sort of a common experience. It can, I guess, the sort of, in particular, society's views of trying to enforce rigid gender norms can put pressure on trans and gender diverse people to medically affirm their gender identity or procure a diagnosis of gender dysphoria. Can create spaces where trans people might be reluctant to engage in social activities, study, work, community events, or support services. And as I just mentioned before, it can also really sort of contribute to the internalization of some of these transphobic beliefs and attitudes, which can have a real sort of impact on trans people's mental health and well-being. And it can also create a real sort of stigma around relationships, in particular around the relationships between cisgender men who might identify as straight or heterosexual, who may be in relationships with or may be attracted to trans women broadly. It's also in terms of like scoping like transmisogyny and its impact on trans women and feminine people, it's really important to be thinking about its impacts on trans women's relationships. And so when you're working with trans women, through, I guess, casework, it's really important to be thinking about intimate partner violence, family violence, and access to healthy relationships. And so we're talking about people's family of origin, and we're also talking about people's intimate relationships. In particular, I really encourage you to, ZGBC recently produced a really fantastic resource called TransFem at transfem.com.au that talks about the relationships between trans women and cisgender, bisexual or heterosexual men. And it's a website designed to create healthy relationships. But in the community consultation for that development of that website, where we interviewed over 30 trans women and cis men, what we found was that trans women in particular were highly impacted by objectification and fetishization of them based upon their gender identity, so being trans, but also upon their sort of like race, ethnicity, or skin color. So acknowledging that trans women of color were sort of like further impacted by objectification and fetishization. We also noticed that within trans femme, there was incredible pressure on trans women to appear hyper feminine and pass as cisgender. So their partners were putting pressure on them to look and dress and act in particular ways. We saw that trans women and trans feminine people's access to public dating and integration into their partner's family and community. And so there were significant barriers to being able to access public dating for some trans women and being introduced to their partner's family or community. Often trans women in those particular relationships were being kept hidden and were being kept secret. There were myths that impacted trans women around deception and in and around challenges in navigating safe disclosure. So in particular for trans women who did pass as a cisgender woman, when they disclosed to someone they were dating, or in particular to men, that they had a trans history or experience, the myths around deception often created significant risk for those trans women for both emotional and physical abuse. Trans femme people are also broadly, in particular young people, are really sort of vulnerable in terms of like having their gender affirmation delayed, denied, or controlled by a family member or their partners in terms of their ability to affirm their sort of gender identity. Also be looking out for things like in broader, this is from another closet, LGBTIQ's domestic and family violence resource. We'll be looking out for humiliation or making fun of someone's body, sexuality, gender identity in a way that's designed to hurt or control them, and sort of like threatening to out people in particular around their gender identity to their family, friends, or at work or to their cultural community. And it can also be preventing people from attending or associating with LGBTIQ people, community, venues and events. So transmisogyny most certainly impacts trans people's relationships. Obviously, trans women date people of all genders. So they might date cis men, they might date cis women, and they may date trans and gender diverse people. But when we're looking at the sort of rates of perpetration of violence, you know, there is much greater risk in and from cisgender men than other communities. So it is important to be aware in terms of service provision that trans women may be put in incredible risk from the sort of following action. So poor service provision because they're trans women, service rejection or removal of care, vilification, abuse and harassment by either service providers or their clients, mismanagement or deliberate breaches in their confidentiality around their sort of trans and gender diverse identity or experience or their sort of like sexuality. They might experience services requiring people to look more feminine in order to access a service. Services might require people to have particular medical procedures in order to access a service. Or services may be asking trans and gender diverse people invasive questions in and around their bodies. It is important to, when reflecting this, trans people's bodies are really highly objectified and people often think they're public property. And so people will ask people really inappropriate questions like, have you had the surgery? It is important to reflect upon sexual harassment legislation that sort of notes that it may be unlawful in terms of asking people private questions in and around their bodies and constituting that as sexual harassment. All of these things can really cause harms, and there's certainly things that we should not be doing, but trans people at risk. When you're working with service providers or you're referring people to particular services, if they're gendered based, it is really important to screen them and to ask people about their trans inclusive policies or get them to develop those policies. And so they're thinking about trans inclusion before the trans woman arrives. Sometimes people try and frame particular issues around trans women accessing women's services that other women may feel uncomfortable. And I just want to highlight what we're talking about here is prioritizing people's uncomfortability over somebody's safety, like real safety. If they're accessing, you know, I think it's their safety, their health, and their well-being. But often if there's so many things we can do in particular around clients, around making them feel more comfortable. And it might be around letting people know, or people know about the types of people that are going to be able to access that services and what they might expect. Include being really sort of clear that it is a trans affirmative space. Have resources, have posters, make sure that's really clear in your sort of like induction, you know, an introduction to the service. So when a trans woman comes up, people already know that. It's not a surprise. They're expecting that. And provide people, I guess, with sort of like education and resources to help them unpack any sort of myths or stereotypes they might have. Doing that work before the trans person arrives really sort of like minimizes the sort of risk of discrimination or having to manage other clients' uncomfortability. I don't think we'd be worrying about uncomfortability for, you know, in terms of like other areas, for, you know, for people in terms of discrimination, like in other areas, if that was like race, religion, all those things, I think we'd really be able to identify that is unlawful and it's discrimination and it's unacceptable behavior. So why do we allow that attitudes and beliefs to go unchallenged when it's around trans women? Discrimination, whatever it is based upon, you know, race, age, gender, sexuality, religion, ability, is all inappropriate, and we need to be confident in being able to challenge that when we see it. So working with trans women and addressing transmisogyny, we just really need to be examining our own beliefs, assumptions, expectations around gender, and challenge them within yourself, your practice, and your workplace. Be like really active in identifying and challenging and addressing transmisogyny when we see it. When we hear people perpetuating really sort of like harmful gender stereotypes and expectations and beauty myths, challenge that and talk about it. Because what we're talking about, I think in particular for trans women, it can also be like passing as a trans woman. I think, you know, there's a certain level of privilege around passing, you know, and for people, not everyone can pass, even if not everyone wants to pass, but not everybody can, even if they want to. Sometimes you've got to have money. It could be depend upon the age of when you transitioned. Being able to have like facial feminization surgery or other surgeries is really expensive. Even being able to access like hormone replacement therapy, there can be significant barriers too. And so we're also talking about class here, you know, wealth. And so people with wealth can sometimes are more likely to be able to have the resources to pass. And then when a trans woman doesn't meet, you know, our expectations, we're really going, you're not beautiful enough to be safe. You're not beautiful enough to be able to access our service. And I think if we expected that of any other woman, I think we would be absolutely horrified of that. We really need to be reinforcing to trans and gender diverse people that I guess that it's valid and healthy and a positive part of identity, and that we have always existed throughout all cultures, you know, and across time. And that there is a diversity of trans women, as there is with all women, you know, in terms of our expression and our experiences. We can also be sharing, I guess, with people like other ways to affirm our gender identity outside of medical affirmation. And it's just really important that we support trans women and trans feminine people in accessing women's services. I guess here at the end is a whole heap of resources that have been developed to support people develop their trans and gender diverse inclusive practice. I really recommend you reading them. Some of them is homelessness guides. but there has been, I guess, less resource developed around AOD bed-based services and LGBTI inclusive care. There's a lot of work has gone in and around the homelessness sector, and they've thought a lot about this and have been given resources to do it. So you might need to look at other sectors' resources to help you, develop your capacity. Cool. That's the end of my presentation in and around trans misogyny. I'm going to stop sharing, and I just want to give anyone the opportunity to ask any questions.
Thanks so much, Starlady. Does anyone have any questions around the presentation? And I guess while people think of questions, I'll just start off. I was just wondering if you've heard anecdotally that you're comfortable sharing, or you've read about, I guess, because the talk was all about transmisogyny and the way it can act as a barrier to service provision, accessing services. There's specific examples that you've heard where women or girls with trans experiences have been expected to meet particular beauty standards, or services have misread their gender because they're not, they don't have a particularly sort of bodily comportment, or they're not not dressing in a way that I guess that is expected from transmisogynistic norms.
I mean, I've definitely just while people are asking questions, I've definitely heard of services denying trans women access to services based upon their presentation. One time I had a homelessness service who's like, oh, actually we're getting this training because we had a trans woman, but she came in here dressed very masculine and even had stubble. And I was like, okay, we're going to unpack that. If she's been experiencing street-based homelessness or other homelessness issues, has she even been able to access a razor? Is it safe for her on the street to be able to present, herself as a woman? Did she lose access to, her clothes? There are, so many different reasons why she might feel unsafe in presenting in a particular way, and that those things really need to be thought about. I get calls all the time around trans women who've been denied access to gender-based services.
Yeah, absolutely.
No questions, Hannah?
Not yet. I was also going to ask, and I know it's a bit of a tricky question, but I know you were talking about in your presentation around, I guess, the slower rates of girls with trans experiences being able to affirm their gender in comparison to maybe men with trans experiences, for example. And I know this is a tricky question, but do you reckon there's ways that you'd like to see, for example, AOD services or healthcare services, ways that they might be able to be to support, young people who may be wanting to affirm their gender as a woman, to help them along with that process because of that gap you identified? I know that's a tricky question.
Yeah, I think it's really about creating safe and inclusive spaces for people to disclose, their sort of gender identity. And so it might be about, in terms of intake of in terms of intake, sharing your own pronouns, wearing rainbow lanyards or rainbow badges or trans badges or that, or also asking people directly around their sort of LGBTIQ status, in particular around their gender identity, and letting people know about your trans inclusion policies or LGBTI inclusion policies, really creating that safe space to be able to provide people the opportunity to, if they want, to be able to disclose their identity, and making sure that we're not making, any assumptions about their identity. I know that I've done it before myself. I've had people in my trainings who sometimes looked really hypermask, and I've foolishly made some assumptions. And, at the end of those trainings, one of those people came up to me and goes, actually, I identify as a trans woman. you know, but I just don't feel, I feel like my family won't support me or will reject me, and it might lead to some family breakdown that I really just don't want to risk. And so I'm unable to affirm my gender identity, you know? And yeah, that was a really big lesson for me, and also not making those assumptions.
Yeah,
I also
absolutely.
think in terms of like, there's some other stuff like that I didn't mention, is I know like in terms of you know, I think with trans women dating cis men, like many cis straight heterosexual men may also date trans women, but there can be a lot of shame around that attraction. And I know that leads to, in terms of like sex and intimacy, those men can have like substance related issues and will often be using substances to I guess like overcome that sort of shame and stigma and become comfortable. But it can also end up putting pressure on trans women to also being, I guess, engaging in that sort of like party and play sex, you know, sex and sexual experiences and intimacy.
Yeah, and thanks so much for talking a bit about the AOD use in this space as well. And yeah, I can definitely sort of, I know NADA put out a guide, the Access and Equity Guide that I linked to, that was talking about the importance of not making assumptions about, you know, people's gender or sexuality when they come into a service. But as you mentioned, there can be ideas about people's gender that are so ingrained that it's just so important to constantly check ourselves. I can definitely identify with that. So
Yeah.
we've got a question from
Shell asked a question,
Shell.
just a quick question.
Do you want me to read it out, Starlady, or would you like to?
Yeah, so for women's services that want to work with trans women but are concerned that their service isn't a safe space yet for trans women, what do you think the first steps for staff and service to ensure they aren't putting, you know, a person in an unsafe space? Well, first of all, I would be like, be really careful of denying trans women access to spaces because you feel like yours is unsafe. Trans women might have really immediate and urgent needs in regards to their safety. And yeah, and so there might be risk, but also like, what is the greater risk? And so you need to be thinking about that. And at the moment, I'd say one of the greater risks is we don't want to be having trans women, you know, at risk, in particular if it's like in and around somebody perpetrating, you know, abuse. That's not always the case, but sometimes, you know, sometimes it might be just a trans woman needs an AOD service urgently. I just think there are like guides out there. I'd be like looking at some of those guides around trans and gender diverse inclusive practice and thinking about them. But there's also simple things like, you know, some services have gone to me or rung us up and go, oh, we've got a trans person who's coming in. We don't feel we're ready. Can you please like give us an urgent training on some like inclusive practice, and can you give a resource list to our staff, or can you just have a quick chat with some of our managers to give us some tips around it? I think it's not that hard to put some sort of like temporary measures in place to sort of like ensure some sort of cultural safety. But then it's also, we really just need your organization to commit to working and developing their trans and gender diverse inclusive practice, you know, broadly. And, you know, and there are many services that are able to help you. I mean, imagine like in New South Wales, you've got 2010, you've got ACON, you've got the Gender Centre. All those services will be able to provide support. Here I'm coming from Victoria, and so some of our services will be like Transgender Victoria or the Zoe-Belle Gender Collective. But reach out. There are services out there who can support you in that work.
Thanks so much for your question, Michelle. Does anyone have any other questions before we wrap up? I'll just check now. Yeah, and do if you're in the New South Wales, like we're also definitely, we have those that NADA resource that I mentioned, and yeah, there is the I guess if you are an AOD service and a member service of NADA, please do be free to reach out to myself or somebody. I'm on the Gender and Sexuality Diverse AOD Worker Network, trans person myself as well. So, there's also that support if you're interested in that. Any more questions?
The only other thing I'd like to say is it's not just trans women who have barriers to gendered AOD services. It'll also be people who identify as non-binary. How do they access those services? And sometimes we also need to be thinking about where do trans men access those services, just showing my solidarity to other members of the community as well.
Yeah, and I absolutely recognise there's so much diversity in trans communities, and the experiences of women in trans communities can be so different to experiences of men and non-binary people. So yeah, absolutely something to think about too when you're accessing training and stuff like that. Well, I think I'll hand it over to Michelle to wrap up, but I just want to say thank you so much, Starlady, for that really awesome presentation, and I'll share that with everyone. Presentation too.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. I just firstly want to really thank Starlady. That was really an amazing and such an important presentation for us to have today. And also, I think it's really exciting about the work that we'll be doing in this really important work in this area, and the forum coming up that will be run by our Gender and Sexuality Diverse network. And I just really want to thank you. I've worked across the drug and alcohol sector for a very long time, and we really need to put a lot of work into this. And I think you kind of confirming that the most important thing is giving people access to services, and I know that's a big priority for our members and for NADA, and reaching out for that support. And there are a lot of services, and there's some fantastic services in New South Wales as well, like ACON and the Gender Centre. So I really want to thank you, Starlady. That was fantastic. And I also really want to thank, firstly, I want to thank Hannah for organising today. There's a lot that goes into organising these events, even if they're online or hybrid, whatever they are. There's a lot to do, and unfortunately there was some technical issues, but that was nothing from Hannah's totally out of their control because of the terrible weather that we're having in New South Wales. And I just too want to acknowledge that the floods and our member services and the communities that are impacted by the floods across New South Wales today. And I know NADA really recognises that for many people this is a really difficult time, and please reach out if there is anything that we can do or assist you with. And yeah, so just we're here for you in that regards. And I also want to thank our panel of women with lived experiences of alcohol and other drug use and accessing services. And thanks to Liz for her amazing facilitation of that panel, I think, and Bianca and Tani's involvement as well, and really good insights into how our member services and how important it is to engage with consumers and consumer participation. I think that Jackie, thank you so much from Jarrah House. The work that you're doing around consumer participation is really inspiring. And I think that, and it's really encouraging to hear how well the audit tool went for your service, and engaging in that, and really taking that on board and moving forward with the consumer work that you're doing. And I also want to shout out, we have a pre-recorded panel that our amazing Rachel Wallace did, and she's our Aboriginal Program Manager, and she did that talking about Aboriginal inclusive practice for women across Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women accessing services. So I really encourage you to log on and listen to that pre-recorded session. And I think that's all the thank yous, and a thank you to Tata and Alice behind the scenes as well, and our Auslan interpreters, Beck and Lizzie. And I hope I haven't forgotten anyone, but I really want to appreciate, really just want to thank everyone for coming today. It was such an important, International Women's Day is a really important day for us to celebrate, and many of the, our sector is about 70% of women working in the sector. So I really want to acknowledge that all the hard work that everyone does. And yeah, thank you. And we will have a a recording of this at a later date that will be available on our website. And if you do have any questions, or if anything's come up from any of the panels or the presentations, please feel free to contact myself or Hannah. So I'll just close it off there, and I hope everyone stays safe out there in the weather, and take care. Thank you.